Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, John. And my gratitude to the Library of Congress for hosting the event. I'll try to put into 30 minutes what happened to me 50 years ago with some reflection. This is my 10th book event since the book was published in September, and each event is different, each audience is different, each of the questions are different. I was a 23-year-old ROTC second lieutenant from a small liberal arts college in Minnesota, sent down to Mississippi along with 15 or around 19,000 other federal soldiers to quell the riot, to put down the riot. I was not aware of what we were doing, where we were going, because the Kennedy administration had put a clamp on public disclosure. And not until we got to Memphis were we aware of our mission. It was such a delicate, uncomfortable effort by our U.S. military. And it was a military, oftentimes I've said it was an army out of place. It was not our mission. Military police had the mission sometimes to put down domestic disturbances, but they occurred once every 100 years or something to that effect. Clearly not the mission of the 82nd Airborne or the 101st or even the Marine Corps, who were present that morning. 19,000 troops. 2 units had prepared, had been given advance notice of what they were doing, and they prepared for it in riot control. Why all of this for one African-American student who wanted to get an education at his brand name university? It's because the whole state was in insurrection, from the governors, from the State House itself, down to the 11-year-old who were throwing bricks at us in the street. It was total chaos, total mayhem. Even the Mississippi Highway Patrol had pulled away, so there was your insurrection. Lasted 2 or 3 days. The violent part of it, and then after that I was appointed to be the security officer for James Meredith and went to school with him, or he went to school. I stayed outside with a hand-picked patrol, 3 jeeps, 12 soldiers, and we were there throughout the year. We transferred back and forth. The Army was in place for almost a year until he graduated in August 1963. I was 23 years old. I grew up in an all-white neighborhood in South Minneapolis. Johnsons, Swensons, Petersons, Bergströms, a few Murphys, a few Italians, but that was pretty much it. And so it was an eye-opening for me, but again, we were trained, and I am so proud of what the Army did. When you write a book, and this is my first, the publisher has the say on what the title should be. I had called it Mississippi Morning, because when we woke up, it was 6 o'clock in the morning, tear gas had passed, sun had come up, it looked like any other small town. It was an awakening, but it was also an awakening of the culture. The University of Mississippi would never go back to its old days. But the publisher comes along and wanted James Meredith to be in it. The book is not about James Meredith. So often book titles, the subtitle carries the story, and it is a soldier's story. An army out of place, yes. But again, they did their job. I saw pieces of violence after that first morning, but then we moved into somewhat boredom to the point that even he himself, James Meredith, an eccentric character, but a brave character, sort of chafed at being guarded as we would guard him, not moving him around from point to point, as we were advised by John Doerr, my iconic hero, civil rights hero, first assistant in the Civil Rights Division, and Nicholas Katzenbach. He was to have as much freedom as any other student. Well, yes, but at the same time, there are deer hunters, and it was the season, and we were constantly aware who might come up onto the campus, didn't look like a student, had a bent mind and a deer rifle, and we had to be constantly aware of that kind of threat to his life. He was a brave person. I was sitting in his dormitory room the first couple days reading the hate mail, the death threats, and they're very accurate, very detailed. James, we know where you live. We know where your parents are. We're going to kill you. We're going to kill your twins. And I looked at James and I said, have you read this one? He looked back at me. He said, Lieutenant, I'm late for my Spanish class. Let's go. That kind of bravery stayed with him, and that kind of courage stayed with him throughout my association with him. He never cracked, he never blinked. The students blinked. I should say that 99% of the student body went about their way getting an education. They cared little about him being on the campus. To them, it may have been an annoyance. We were the annoyance for the students. There was a handful of students who would go wherever he went, every corner. Here comes a nigger. Go back to Africa, you black bastard. We're going to get you. We're going to get you. And that stayed on through October, November. But it lessened when I came back in the spring. The racial attitudes were still there. He always reminded me that it wasn't just the students yelling out. It was their parents, their grandparents, the legacy of the separation of races in that state. It was there then. It's to a certain extent. It's there now. 50 years later, we have an African American president, and the night he's reelected, there's a disturbance on the campus. It should not be blown up. Many of the headlines the next morning said racial protest at Ole Miss. Well, it was not. It was a group of students who didn't like the results of the election, but just a handful of them were throwing out racial slurs, screaming. So that has to be in context. Ralph alluded to Mississippi today. There's an expression, Mississippi was, Mississippi is. It means they've changed. They've changed in a way that I think a lot of the northern press was not aware of then of the racial issue, and probably not aware now. The Army had been, thank you, Harry Truman, the Army had been desegregated to a point by the time I got into 1962, it was flattened out. There may have been racism back in the barracks and the tents, but it was not out in the open. Alabama PFCs saluted black officers, took the orders from black sergeants. Once we left the comfort of the Army bases and the posts as we moved south, it was a different culture that we got into. And of course, it was a freeze frame, a photograph, a snapshot of racism that we saw that first morning and continue to see while we were there. So kudos to the military. They did a good job. My driver one time asked me, Lieutenant, what are we doing? Are we doing any good down here? And this was late November. I said, well, he's still alive, isn't he? The only way I can respond to that, to a direct question. But that answer to that question was enriched and embraced 50 years later. I was in Jackson, Mississippi earlier last month on the fifth of 6 book events. William Winter Archives, downtown Jackson, middle class, mixed race, African American white audience, maybe 30 or 40. I told them the arc of my story, and then we went into a question and answer period for about 20, 30 minutes. A little bit of a larger room than this here. It was an African American woman about the second row back was sort of fidgeting, and I knew that she wanted to say something. I wound down, I said, are there any more questions? She shot her hand up. She said, yes, I want to say something. I don't know how I can say it, but I said, go ahead, ma'am. I think I've got enough nerve to say it, but I want to thank you for coming. I didn't know if she meant that morning or 50 years ago. She said, let me tell you my story. I was growing up at Vicksburg. Daddy told us that night to stay in the house and stay away from the windows. There's trouble out on the street, not a lot of noise out in the street. It was not a good time for blacks in Vicksburg. It was not a good time for blacks to be in the state of Mississippi. That weekend, I had faith in only 2 things, God and the United States Army. That moment, I grabbed the podium. She started tearing up. As I tried to respond, I started tearing up. And there was obviously a murmur of approval throughout the audience. So she stood up, pointed her finger at me, and she said, thank you for coming. I came over here 50 years later to say that. And she sat down. It was worth everything. The book tour, I have a university press. They don't pay advances. I go to hotels. I pay for the airfare, pay for the hotel, pay for everything. Because I want to get the message out. I want to get young people to know about what happened 50 years ago. But that poignant moment answered the question that my driver asked me 50 years earlier. Sir, are we doing any good down here? So I'll never forget that moment. Putting a book together like this 50 years later, it is in the first person because I wanted the reader to almost, well, to be with me, but almost be ahead of